what I'm going to do is choosing the right reserve study and how to exceed the standards. So that's what we'll be talking about today. And is what is a reserve study? What are the types of reserve studies? What do all reserve studies leave out? How to determine what type of study you need, and what the RFP for reserve study should include, and what you should do when you get your reserve study. And then I've got some random thoughts that I've thrown in there. One of the things that you have to remember is that, let's see, can I see the chat? Chat. Oh yeah, I can see the chat. I can see this. Voice to text is wonderful. Thank you. And yes, questions, can you get the slides? Yeah, what we do after the presentations, we'll send everybody a copy of the presentation. But I don't know if everybody here realizes it, but in my experience, and let's see, this is a little bit of my background, I was very involved in the development of the National Reserve Study Standards, CAI. As a matter of fact, I actually led the committee that did it. And one of the things you have to realize is that the National Reserve Study Standards are the minimum standards for doing a reserve study. So for example, if you're building something to the building code is the minimum standards of how to build it. The reserve study standards are the minimum standards for doing a reserve study. So I think when I go through this, you'll see that there are a number of things that should be asked for as part of a reserve study that are not, because people will assume that you just say, I want like a reserve study, and everybody's doing the same thing and you're getting the same thing. And I just want to start out by saying that those standards are minimum standards. And I think you'll understand that in many cases, you actually want more than that or need more than that. So what is a reserve study? Reserve study is a budget. It's a budget planning tool that establishes a stable and equitable funding plan to offset anticipated future major common area expenditures. That's the terminology that comes directly from the national standards. So the thing to remember, it's a budget. It's not an exact price when you see the things in the reserve study. And it's how much money should you set aside so when it comes time to replace the roof, you'd have enough money. That's essentially it. But it's a budget tool that guides you towards doing that. What are the standards? The National Reserve Study Standards, the Community Associations Institute. By the way, this is an old cover of that standards because I don't think CAI has been at 1630 Duke Street in Alexandria for years. But like I said before, like any other standards, these are the minimum requirements for doing a reserve study. What are the types of reserve study? And I'm going to go into a little detail on what they are so you understand what you're asking for. But there's a full study, there's an update with a site visit, there's an update with a note without a site visit, and there is a preliminary study. The National Reserve Study Standards were just updated about 2-3 years ago. I co-chaired the national committee that updated them, and one of the things we added was a level of service, which is a preliminary reserve study. And that is essentially a reserve study for before community is built, because when a developer builds a community, they include a budget, and in that budget is a reserve study, and the reserve study is a reserve study prepared based on the design drawings, but without the community actually being built yet. And there are a lot of people across the country that do what are these type of studies. Well, we used to do a lot of them also, but which is another story. But it's a preliminary study which there was never really a name to it. So the new standards do include what's called a preliminary study. So those are the 4 different types of level of service. The reserve study has 2 parts. It's the physical analysis and the financial analysis. Those 2 parts are made up as 5 tasks. And the 5 tasks are the component inventory, condition assessment, life evaluation estimates for the physical analysis, and the fund status and the funding plan for the financial analysis. Now I'm going to go through each one of these in a little bit more detail so that you understand what they are, so you'll know what you're asking for, and you'll see different areas of things you should ask for over and above that and why. So task 1 is the physical analysis, and first part of that is the component inventory. What that means is in the reserve study standards, what we talk about is each of the common elements is called a component. So that's where the term component comes from. So component inventory is the selection of the common area components to include a study. So how do you know which components to include? And it's based on the common and limited common elements. So the starting point is to review the governing documents to determine what are the common and limited common elements and who's responsible for their replacement. Now, the reason I put in there who's responsible for their replacement is, you'll see in a second, well, it deals with limited common elements because in most instances, you just assume it's a common element, so it's the responsibility of the association to replace, which is generally true for a general common element. But a limited common element, and by definition, a limited common element is a part of your common elements that's used only by an individual homeowner and not by the entire community. So for example, the most common types of limited common elements may be a deck on the back of a home, a balcony on the back of a home, like on a high rise on a balcony. That may be a limited common element, which for the exclusive use of that homeowner that lives in that home, but it's called a limited common element. The reason I say that you need to determine who's responsible for it is when you look at the governing documents, in some instances, the unit owner may be responsible for the maintenance and replacement of a limited common element. In other instances, the unit owner may be responsible for the maintenance and the association is responsible for the replacement. In other instances, it may be the association is responsible for the maintenance and the unit owner is responsible for the replacement. So that's why it's important to take a look at documents to see who's responsible for the replacement of that limited common element. And that's why I put in here and who's responsible for the replacement, because with limited common elements, it may vary. We've seen some documents that in the beginning, it says the limited common element is responsibility for maintenance and replacement by the association. Then you go further on into the same document, it says something different. So there is some document problems sometimes also. So the selection is based on, number one, review the governing documents to determine what are the common elements, limited common elements, and who's responsible. The second thing is the age of the component. And the reason I say the age is the general rule is that if when you do a reserve study, if one of these common elements will require replacement within 30 years of doing that study, then it's something that should be included on the study as a component. But if it's something with a useful life of more than 30 years, it doesn't need to be included on the component list. And that's kind of a national standard for a guideline, this 30 years. I will say that in New Jersey, there are no statutory requirements for community associations to do reserve studies or to update them. But I think I mentioned before that developers have a statutory requirement to include reserves in their initial budgets. The statutory requirement up until just recently said that the developer should include adequate reserves, but there was never a definition of what adequate means. Right now, and it's been approved. I'm sorry?
Excuse me, there was a question, what type of components would last more than 30 years?
Oh, there, what kind of component? I missed it. Well, let's say, for example, wood siding on a building. You have wood siding on a building or vinyl siding on a building. And the wood siding, typically, if it's maintained properly, which I'll touch on in a few minutes, will have a useful life of more than 30 years. And it's a great question because you're going to see one of the things that's missed on a lot of reserve studies, but those are the type of things, vinyl siding, wood siding, aluminum siding, these type of things have a useful life of more than 30 years generally. So it's a great question. And now, you know, the age of the component is a very critical thing when you're having your reserve studies update. I'll explain why it is in a minute. But that's a great question as far as what things have those useful lives. So the statutory requirements in New Jersey for developers are in the process right now of being revised. And what it says is that the developer has to include all common elements that will require replacement within 30 years, except for roofs have to be included even if their useful life is more than 30 years. So that's what you're going to find is the statutory requirement in the state of New Jersey for developers starting very soon. It's actually out for public comment right now. If anybody would like a copy of what those guidelines are for developers, but it's going to also reduce the risk for people who do reserve studies for developers, and it's going to really define for associations going through transition, what does it mean for adequate funding? Because these days there's a fair amount of litigation that goes on in the transition process where an association will make a claim against the developer for underfunded reserves. And that was happening a lot because the statutory requirement was adequate with no definition of adequate. And now there is a definition of adequate. So hopefully that a lot of that litigation will disappear. If there's any attorneys joining us today, they might be upset because that type of litigation may disappear. So task 1 is the component inventory. Task
So
2, I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, should detention basins be included in the reserve study?
Sally, you're asking a lot of questions. It's not your saying no. Well, it depends. I mean, the detention basin itself is generally not included, but some detention basins have what's called a low flow channel, which is like a sidewalk that runs from the inlet structure of the detention basin to the outlet structure of the detention basin. Sidewalks are included typically on a reserve study with a useful life of 30 years. So if you have a detention basin that is grass, you cut the grass and it's a maintenance issue, but if it has a low flow channel or something that is part of that detention basin that has a useful life of 30 years or less, it should be included. It's a good question. So yes, but the most common thing we see with detention basins is that low flow channel. And like I said, it's pretty much like a 3 or 4 foot wide sidewalk that runs from one end to the other. So that would generally be included, yes. So next is the condition assessment. And there are a few different types of study with a full study and an update with a site visit. Doing a condition assessment essentially means going out to the community, looking at that sidewalk or low flow channel in the detention basin, seeing what condition it's in to estimate the remaining useful life of that low flow channel. So for example, if that low flow channel or the sidewalk has a useful life of 30 years and your community is 15 years old, what we're doing is we're going out to take a look at it to see, will this last 15 years because that's what it's budgeted for, or is it in bad condition? Should we reduce the remaining life to 10 years, or is it in great condition? Should we increase the life to another 20 years? So that's what a condition assessment does. The reason why I've broken it down into the type of studies, and by the way, as you can see, I'm making the assumptions that there's a fair amount of knowledge in our audience about reserve studies, but if you have any questions about any of these, please feel free to jump in, which you are. But in a full study, which you do everything, or an update with a site visit, you actually go out and look. If you do an update without a site visit, sometimes the community will do an update. They say, we want to, for budgetary purposes, we want to update our reserve studies, but we don't want a site visit. Then the condition assessment is just based on age. So we go back to the sidewalk, 30 years old, has a 30-year life, it's 15 years old. Then we would establish in a paper update an estimated remaining life of 15 years because we haven't looked at it to see the condition. In a preliminary study that is put together, as I mentioned before the community is built, obviously you can't do a condition assessment because it's not there yet. So if it's not yet built, the assumption is that everything will attain its full useful life. So the sidewalk, 30-year life, 30-year remaining life because it's not built yet. But that's what the condition assessment is for the different types of study. Task 3 is the life and valuation estimates. The life estimate is just establishing the estimated full useful life and remaining useful life, which I talked about a second ago, but it's based on reference materials. There are a number of reference materials out there that say for different types of things, how long should they last? Experience, for example, we, like most engineering firms, have a lot of experience inspecting sites and seeing how long do things really last, and the site visits that I talked about. So that's where these life estimates come from. The other part of task 3 is the valuation estimate. The valuation estimate is how much will it cost to replace it? And this is done by reference materials. For example, a lot of people use what's known as the RS means estimating standards. And these estimating standards give different costs for doing different things. So you use estimating standards. Again, there's experience. For example, if we're involved with a project where we know, like a lot of roofing projects, we're involved in a lot of roofing projects where we know generally how much it will cost to replace a roof. So it's based on experience. The thing I put in here that you have to remember is that these replacement costs include not only the cost of putting something in, but the cost of taking something out. So using the roof as an example, it includes taking out the existing shingles and putting in new shingles. It's very critical because sometimes in some instances, the cost of removing something is actually more than the cost of putting it in. For example, if you take a sidewalk, the cost of putting in a new sidewalk may be $3 or $4 a square foot, but the cost of taking it out may be $6 a square foot. So I just wanted to make a note of that. So task 3 is the life and valuation estimates. This is what the physical analysis looks like. You've all seen it, I'm sure. And it's starting from left to right, left column is all the listing of the components. Next column is the quantity, and keep in mind, they don't have to be in this order, but this is the order that we use. Next column is the quantity of that component. Next is the cost, the replacement cost. Then the next column is how much it will cost to replace it, which is just the quantity times the unit cost. Beginning balance is how much is set aside. So that most associations have money set aside. So it's just distributed to each component based on a weighting factor. And then estimated useful life, full useful life, estimated remaining useful life, and then the annual reserve funding required, which is very simple. It's a mathematical equation. The replacement cost minus your beginning balance divided by the estimated remaining useful life is your annually reserve funding required. And then you add all those up and it comes to a total. Keep in mind, and I'll touch on it again in a few minutes, that you don't just add these up for all the components and that's the number you use. That is not the correct way to do the reserve study, as you'll see when we get into the financial analysis, which is next. The financial analysis is broken into two parts. First is the fund status. And the definition says that the measure of the strength of the funding. I don't agree with that. I think it's just a number. And in most cases, unless you really dig deeper, the number doesn't mean a lot. So, but it's part of the study and it just gives a relative strength, I'll call it. So for example, you have a $100,000 replacement cost, 10-year life, which means you should set aside $10,000 a year. So after 3 years, you would have $30,000. If you only have $15,000 rather than $30,000, that means you are 50% funded. That's what the fund status is. Again, it's just a relative number, and it's very misleading because, which I'll talk about in a second, it's measured against full funding, not adequate funding. So what I mean by that is that number may be 50%, and you may get scared by it and say, I should be at 100%, but you may be adequately funded even if you're at 50%, which I'm going to touch on next. So, but that's the fund status and a measurement tool that's used. The other part of financial analysis is the funding plan. This is just the community's plan to provide income to offset the expenditures. Now you see I've done these in task 1 through 5 because I kind of done it in the order that you do it, but the task 5, which is the funding plan, is actually the conclusion to the study. And this is what gives you the answers and gives you what you should be doing. And so task 5, the funding plan, is the most important part of the study. But if you get the physical analysis wrong, the funding plan will be wrong. But assuming you get the physical analysis and everything up to this point done correctly, the funding plan is the most important part of the entire study. And what does it look like? It's a cash flow projection. And I think you can see my pointer, but it's a cash flow projection. You start with a certain amount of money in your fund right here. You accumulate money by putting it aside each year. Whenever time you replace something, the line drops down and it goes out 30 years. These are the funding plans. The top one is what's called full funding. And this is kind of a reserve study seminar, but I'm building up to where I'm going with this. But the top one is full funding, which means you just add everything together and that's the number. One of the problems with full funding is in most instances, like here, you have a lot of money that's sitting in your account. It goes to a low point at some point in the future, but there's a lot of money sitting in your account. So that's why I say that in most instances, full funding is overfunding. The other end of the spectrum is what's called baseline funding, which is the green line, where you reduce your annual contribution to zero, so to a point where it goes to zero in the future, which theoretically is the most cost-effective way to do it, but it's the most risky also, because if this component in this year costs more to replace than you budgeted, you're going to go into a deficit, or if this component has to be replaced a year earlier, you can go into a deficit. So full funding, baseline funding, somewhere in the middle is threshold funding, where most communities are. So that's why I make the argument that full funding is overfunding, baseline funding is too risky, somewhere in the middle is adequate funding for your community. But these are what the different funding plans look like. And I'm assuming most of the people in this presentation today are managers and board members. But if you go into a board meeting and get a reserve study, you understand this chart, this is the most important part of the study. I will tell you that most firms, what they do is they build up in their reserve study report, and this is the conclusion. And this is the conclusion. One of the things that we're doing is we're going to start putting this at the front of our report, with the numbers being the backup to come to this conclusion, just in terms of presentation. But the funding plans, that's what they look like, most important part. This is just a summary. It's a chart that says the type of study, what's included in it. So type of study, full study, component inventory, condition assessment. These are the things that are included. So you can see in a full study, you do all 5 tasks. You do the component inventory, condition assessment, life evaluation, fund stats, and funding plan. Because a full study, you do everything. In an update with a site visit, you're updating somebody else's study. So you're not figuring out what the components are. You're not figuring out the quantity of the components. And you're using the past study for all this information, and you're assuming it's correct, which I'm going to get to in a second. The condition assessment is based on a site visit. Like I talked about before, you're doing a life evaluation estimate. You're doing everything here. You're doing 4 of the 5 tasks because you're not figuring out what the components are or what the quantity is. Update with a site visit, you're not doing any of the components or the quantities, and the condition assessment, like I talked about before, is based only on age. And a life that you're doing everything, but you're only doing, I'd say, 3.5 of the 4 things, because in the condition assessment, you're not looking at it, you're only reducing the number of years that it's old, how old it is. Preliminary, you're doing in quantification and selection, but it's based on design drawings. You're not looking at things to see how they're actually built, so you're only doing it based on the design drawings. You're not doing condition assessment because it's not built yet, and you do the other 3 parts. But that's just a summary of the things I've talked about so far. Anybody have any questions? Nobody's jumping in right now. So the stuff I've talked about so far is essentially an abbreviated, a reserve study webinar, but I'm using this as the foundation for where I'm going today. So what is left out? And keep in mind, what I said is that a reserve study standard is based on the minimum standard. What is left out? Number 1, let's talk about the components included are those that only require replacement within 30 years of study preparation. What happens as the community ages and the study is updated? Typically, when you ask for a reserve update proposal from somebody, what they're going to do is they're going to take the old study and they're going to update it, which means the components are going to be updated and left alone. They're not adding or subtracting. The quantities are going to be left the same, and they're doing the physical analysis as I talked about. But what happens? What are you missing? This chart is showing you've got one component. It starts with 0. It's born here in the year 2020. In this case, it has a 35-year useful life. So it goes out 35 years, and 35 years it's going to be replaced, and then it starts over again. So up here you see a 30-year replacement projection period. Since this component has a life that's more than 30 years, it's not included in the study. I think you see what the problem is. So it's not included. Now what happens? The community updates their reserve study in 7 years. It was brand new in 2020, now it's 2027. So now this 30-year replacement projection period extends out past the replacement date of that component. It wasn't included in your study before. So now if you're having an update done by somebody, they're doing it by the national standards, they're updating the study based on what components are in there and their useful lives. It does not include in the standards looking at the community to see what else should be added, because now it fits within that 30-year window. So now think about it. You're asking somebody to update a reserve study, and you're not saying to them, do this. So now you get into this 30-year replacement period. Now you're out here, where you're out much further in the future, and all of a sudden you realize that, I'm going to use wood siding as an example. The wood siding had a 35-year life, and now all of a sudden it wasn't on the study, and now you're 10 years away, and you're starting to see that it needs to be replaced, and you're going to add it to the study, and now you're amortizing the replacement cost of that wood siding over only 10 years instead of over the full 30 years. It's absolutely critical that when you ask for an update, you also ask, especially as communities are getting a little older, I would say anytime after maybe 5 years, you ask the person who's doing that update to review the community to see if anything should now be added to the study. This is absolutely critical, and it's left out. What's next? If you have a component that has 100, yes.
One question, would this apply to risers and mid-rise building?
A great question. One of the problems that the industry is grappling with and does not know how to solve it is you have a mid-rise or a high-rise building that has risers. those risers now fall within that 30-year time frame. You can't really see them, so the answer is yes. The question is, how do you get there? And CAI is one of the references I'll show you at the end of its presentation, has just come out with a paper on how to review the infrastructure so you can start including these things onto your reserve study. But Monica, you are absolutely right. It does apply. The question is, it's a lot of times, not the question, the comment I'll make, a lot of times things like that are missed. They're missed, and that's why I suggest, as you'll see later on, that a reserve study based on the type of building should be more extensive than just the standard, because you really need to, for example, do what I said in the last slide, but really start evaluating the building, evaluating the maintenance problems you're having with the building. For example, if you have risers that they're starting to have problems and you replace some of them, or you replace parts of them, or whatever you do, the reserve provider really has to start asking questions about the building as they get older to determine things like that and including them. But the easy answer is, as soon as it falls within that 30-year time frame, absolutely it should be included, because if it's not, where's the money going to come from? So it's a great question, and it's a great question. I don't really have a perfect answer, but it's a great question. And one of the things that a lot of communities do is that they hire a company to do a reserve study. And I hate to say, but they base it purely on price, not on experience, not on this type of knowledge. And they really can't help. And what happens is you keep getting updates on including things when managers really need to be able to explain to the boards why you need to do something more, so you don't get stuck with a problem of having to replace a riser where you don't have money. So, but what's next? Making sure that all the components attain their estimated remaining lives. Now, that's the example. You have a $100,000 replacement cost, a 10-year useful life. That means it's $10,000 a year for this example. Let's say that because whatever this component is, it's not maintained, and you find that instead of having a 10-year life, it only has a 5-year life. So instead of setting aside $10,000 a year, you're setting aside $20,000 a year, and you have a $10,000 a year shortfall because the thing is not going to attain its full useful life. Let me ask you a question. How many people out there, when you ask somebody to do a reserve study, ask them also to include a deferred maintenance schedule of how you maintain the components so that they do attain their full useful life, so you don't run into a problem like that? Does anybody want to answer that question about asking about the deferred maintenance? I will tell you, I see you're all kind of shy this morning. Let's see. We did. Okay, that's great. That's great to hear. There is one management company I know of that when they ask for reserve studies, they do an RFP, pretty basic RFP, they do it, and they insist that a reserve study has to be done with a deferred maintenance schedule because of the connection between them. But I see when I haven't done it, but we will. You see, it makes a big difference, because if it doesn't attain its full useful life, you're amortizing the cost over a much shorter useful life, which means it goes up. So I'm glad you see what I'm saying. Now, the evaluation of the replacement components, the standards, the reserve study standards say that well, they don't really say, but they imply that when you're doing an update and you're replacing a component, I'm going to use the example of wood fence, replacing a wood fence, what is the study included as a replacement with? It's replaced with a wood fence. So what are you missing here? What's left out? What's left out is taking a look at what you're replacing with to see if you want to replace it with the same thing. Wood fence, $75,000 replacement cost. It has a 15-year life. So 75 divided by 15 is $5,000 a year, I think. But then in order to attain that 15-year life, or maybe get some more life out of it, there's a $25,000 painting cost every 5 years. So 25,000 painting divided by 5 years is $5,000 a year. So your total for that fence isn't really just the $5,000 a year replacement cost. It's the $5,000 a year replacement cost, plus the $5,000 a year maintenance cost for the painting, for a total of $10,000 a year. Okay? Now the numbers are, not exact, but it's the concept. Now let's say that, I'm sorry?
I'm sorry.
Deferred maintenance schedule is standard part of the study. That's because nobody asks for it. The National Reserve Study standards are based on doing reserve studies. They're not based on anything more than that. They're the minimum standards of how much you should set aside. It's a great point. There's never been any discussion about making the deferred maintenance schedule a requirement when doing a reserve study, but it's not in there. And I would say that it's very, very rare that we're asked for a proposal to do a reserve study and a deferred maintenance schedule at the same time. It's, hopefully you'll, and I see that you do, you'll catch on to what's missing in the reserve study. And when you start doing your RFPs, which we'll talk about in a few minutes for reserve studies, you're going to ask for that cost also as an option. But maybe it should be part of the standards, or maybe there should be a standard for deferred maintenance schedules. I'm not sure, but right now it isn't there, and very rarely is it done. So now getting back to the fence example. All right, instead of putting in your reserve study replacement of a wood fence for $75,000, what if you looked at it and did a life cycle cost analysis and said, okay, instead of a wood fence, let's do a vinyl fence. It's going to cost more money. It's going to cost $100,000 instead of $75,000. But now instead of a 15-year life, it has a 30-year life, and it's $3,333 a year. But what's the difference between a vinyl fence and a wood fence? Vinyl fence doesn't need to be painted. So take the painting out of the equation, and instead of paying a total of $10,000 a year for a wood fence, you're spending $3,300 a year for a vinyl fence. So it's a savings of $6,700 a year by changing the component on the reserve study at the time that you do the study. Again, this is an example, but think about it when you're talking about how many people there have wood retaining walls. The wood retaining walls, they rot away 15 to 20 years. I've seen a lot of communities replace it with a block wall instead of a wood wall. Then it comes off the reserve study completely because it has a very long, indefinite useful life. There's no maintenance, and the association may pay more, but they never have to fund for it again. Now, the question comes up, well, where am I going to get the money to pay more for something? Go back to the cash flow projections and the fact that you always have you generally have a lot of money sitting in your reserve fund account. So take some of that money there to do a higher grade replacement, and it's not going to affect your funding. It's going to help your funding as you start amortizing the things over that 30-year extension, even though it costs you slightly more to do it at that time. So that's it when it comes to maintenance. But what else is even more important, or just as important, but especially in high rises? What about energy costs? You've got to.
Excuse me, Mitch, before we get into energy costs, do any of our clients request a full reserve study after several updates have been done over the years? At what point, if any, would you advise a client to do a full study instead of an update?
Where's that question? I don't see it, but
it's in the Q&A section.
All right, but I'm going to get there. That's part of the presentation. Because
Okay.
I'm going to talk a little bit about updates, types of updates, and when you should do them. But that's a great question also.
All right, thank you.
All right, now here's another one. What is left out? Again, I'm talking about it's not just a standalone replacement cost, it's maintenance costs. What about energy costs? You've got a boiler, $160,000 replacement cost, a 20-year useful life, which is $8,000 a year. Pretty straightforward. But now this standard boiler, you have a $50,000 a year energy cost. So let's see, so you add your total cost for the year is $8,000 a year for replacement, $50,000 a year for energy, $58,000. Now, for those of you who are dealing with high rises, you know that these numbers are pretty low, but I'm just giving the concept. So it's $58,000 a year. Now, when you do a typical reserve study, you're replacing it with a similar type boiler. So now let's do an energy efficient replacement. It may cost more. It's going to cost $200,000. Has the same useful life. 200,000 divided by 20 years is $10,000 a year. So your cost for replacement goes from 8 to 10,000 a year, but your energy costs go to 30,000 from 50,000. So your total per year is now, instead of 50,000, it's 58,000, it's 40,000. So you're saving of $18,000 a year. This is a very simple example, and these numbers I'm showing are much lower than they typically are. But multiply that $18,000 a year over 10 years, you're saving $180,000. Keep in mind also, this does not include incentives. And why isn't the deferred maintenance schedule? I'm not sure of that question, Debbie. If you could restate it. Let's see. Oh, why isn't the deferred maintenance schedule stand part of the study? I think I answered that already. It should be. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, you already answered that one.
Yeah. So now let's go to the next slide, because this savings of $18,000 a year is assuming that you're paying $200,000 for a high efficiency boiler. It leaves out something critical. Right now, there are significant incentives available. And I put this slide in here because when you go to life cycle costing, what I'm saying is, what else is there for each component other than the replacement? It's not just the replacement cost, it's the maintenance and energy. But I don't want to forget the incentives. So for example, if you go to this website, dsireusa.org, what's going to happen is this over here is what the page on the website looks like. You see the whole country. You click on any state, and it'll tell you all of the available incentives for energy efficiency upgrades. So for example, I did this yesterday, and in the state of New Jersey, there are 74 programs. So you click on New Jersey, it lists all the programs. If you want to know how to apply for any one of those programs, then you click on that link and it tells you how to apply for it. Keep in mind, you have to apply for these things before you buy something. In New Jersey, there's some great programs like the Pay for Performance program, Direct Install, there's a number of them. And if you want more information, either look there or give us a call. But the other thing that the beauty of this is, these incentives, let's say you're set aside 90% of the cost of replacing your boiler. And then there's an incentive in there that will pay for 50% of the cost of the boiler. They're not asking you for your reserve study money that you've accumulated back. It doesn't happen. You get this money and it could be a real bonus to the community or to you and your individual homes. So my comment is, before you do anything replacing anything that uses any type of energy, take a look at what type of incentives they are. And I'm not sure how many people are here from out of state, but go to this website and you can get information on any state and what the incentives are. And there are some great programs out there. So when I did this example before, I only based it on the energy cost savings, and I didn't include in there any incentives in terms of the cost of replacing that piece of equipment. So that's what's left out, life cycle costing. Keep in mind, it's not just the replacement cost. Yeah, in order to really look at it, what's missing from the reserve study, what's missing from it is looking at the maintenance costs on top of it and the energy costs on top of the components. So what kind of study do you need? A couple of guidelines. If your community is new and you're going through transition, you should have a full study prepared. And that the reason is, a couple logical things. The study in the initial budget, which we talked about, the preliminary study, is based on the drawings, not the as-built community. And I'm not saying it's bad, but it's very rare that it matches exactly. So your reserve study should be based on what's actually there, not what's shown on the drawings. So when you build a community, some of the materials may be changed also. So the budget, the reserve study should be based on what's actually there. The study in the initial budget was prepared prior to construction. So that means that the public offering statement or the governing documents was prepared before the community was built. So let's see, it's prepared in year one. Then by the time you get approvals, the community is built. It could be 3 or 4 years later, but the budget in the governing documents is based on the replacement costs at the time the study was done. And now you're 4 or 5 years later and those costs have changed. The initial study was based on generally on full occupancy. It's based on the community, entire community being built. When you do a reserve study, it's based on when things are actually built, not assuming everything is built at the same time. And it has an impact because if you start accumulating for things when it's actually built, it could have make a difference in terms of what your annual contributions are.
Would an engineer advise you of possible incentives based on the study project it is working on?
Mariel, are you talking about in terms of the incentives for replacing equipment? If you're talking about that,
yes,
absolutely they can, but I'm going to get there in a few minutes. You have to ask them. If you don't ask them, they're not doing it. If you ask them for an update to a reserve study, they're not going to do that life cycle cost. They're not going to do anything of what the questions are. You have to ask them. And that's why this presentation is based on why is the standard the minimum, and what should you really ask for when you request a reserve study to do it right for budgeting purposes. So they ain't doing it unless you ask for it. Let's put it that way. It's a very competitive industry, and most associations will hire a reserve provider based on low cost. I mean, I hate to say it, experience and things like that generally don't seem to matter. But you as the manager have to educate your boards to the reason why you need to do these type of things, and you have to ask for them. But Next thing in
We have-
line here about doing the full study. Unfortunately, that is true, yes. But you know, the thing is, I'm a firm believer that boards are not dumb, most of them. But your role is to educate them. And I have seen that if you educate them and give them the knowledge about this kind of stuff, in most cases, they understand and they want to do it right. This is where they live. And even if they're only going to live there 7 or 10 years, it has an effect on the property values. So I really, you know, you guys are the teachers that are going to go to your boards and explain this kind of thing and do this kind of stuff and explain to them why you did it. I remember once a number of years ago, we did a specification for the replacement of a boiler. And we did it based on an energy efficient boiler. And what happened was the energy cost went back down, exactly the example I gave you. So I was at a board meeting when contractors were coming in one at a time. And one contractor came in and said, the engineer spec'd this boiler, but I can give you a boiler for about $20,000 less. And the manager looked at him in front of the entire board and says, but do you take into account the energy savings and what was spec'd? The contractor didn't know what to say. And the manager said, well, you know, if we go with this boiler that was spec'd, we're going to we're going to make up the savings. Our break even is going to be less than a year. So it's worth it for us to spend more, not to get the cheaper one where the energy is higher. So it really, you know, managers are the key. You guys are the ones who are the gatekeepers and bring the knowledge and do this kind of stuff. But I like to think it makes you guys look great too. All right, now the next.
We have another question. The reserve study basically gives you a line item budget. Most associations use the pool of accumulated funds to cover any number of projects. Is this typical? Is it in opposition to standards? That is in the Q&A part.
Do I have the Q&A part?
Oh, yeah.
All right, I do have the Q&A. I should have both of these up on my screen. The reserve study basically gives you a line on a budget. Most associations, the pool of accumulated funds to cover any number of projects. Is this typical? No, it's absolutely not in opposition to the standards. As a matter of fact, that's what the standard is. If you use the line item budget and add everything together, that's called the component method, and that is full funding. The threshold method, the baseline funding, is based on pooling of the funds. As a matter of fact, if you look at the cash flow projections that we do, we have a term in there. It's called, what is the pooling factor? And the pooling factor is what you're multiplying it by in order to come up with your threshold or your baseline. But the pooling of accumulated funds is the way to do it. That's the proper way to do it. The standards include that in there. And if you look in the standards, I can actually, let's see, I think I left them here so you could see them. I'm going to, where did they go? I can show you in the standards that, can I pull this over here for a second? Let me see. I can show you in what it says because it includes it. And what it is, it lists the different types of studies, baseline, full funding, threshold funding, in terms of what is the most risky and what is the most conservative. It accepts all of them, full funding being the most conservative, baseline being the most risky, and threshold pooling is what most people use, which helps them come up with their threshold. If you want, we have an entire webinar, which I think we gave a few weeks ago, on what is the proper pooling that you should use to make sure that you are still adequately funded. And we can send that to you also. It's a great question, but absolutely the standards allow using that. All right, continuing on in this, a new study for a new community full funding. The other thing, which I hate to mention, the fourth bullet point down, is the study in initial budget may be wrong. Most people, when they go through transition, they have a reserve study done. And in some instances, they say that the reserve study in the original governing documents was underfunded. And so it becomes a transition claim, I'd say. So it may be wrong, but that problem is being dealt with very strongly by the DCA and in the statutory requirements, where now it does explain what adequate funding means.
Should studies, I'm sorry. I'm trying to jump in when you take a breath. Should studies include a project-oriented collection of costs, such as refurbish the ballroom to make it easier to determine the cost for doing a project?
I'm not sure exactly what that means. Should studies include project-oriented collection of costs? Well, the reserve study is based on components. If redoing the ballroom is one of those components, then it is a project-oriented collection of costs. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but keep in mind when you say, make it easier to determine the cost for doing the project. Keep in mind a reserve study is a budgetary tool. So one of the things, don't ever get misled to think that if it comes time to replace anything that's on your reserve study, the cost to do it is going to match exactly what it says on the reserve study. But it's based on a project basis. The other thing is if you meet with the reserve provider or in your RFP, ask them, they could break out things certain specific ways for your components if you want it done that way. For example, we were just retained to do a reserve study yesterday. And one of the questions that was asked was, can you set up the reserve study so it breaks it down in terms of sections of the community rather than the overall community? And the answer was absolutely, if you'd like us to do it that way. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but and then be aware that I talked about that the initial statutory requirements have changed, at least in the state of New Jersey. A lot of states do have statutory requirements in regards to reserve studies. New Jersey, Pennsylvania are not them. What kind of study you need? If your community is having an update performed and the community is less than 5 years old and has lost confidence, sometimes associations say we want a full study because we've lost confidence in the old study. We do not want an update. I would say 9 out of 10 times, you really don't need a full study to be done. You just need to have certain areas of the study that was there used that you have confidence in, and certain parts of the study that you've lost confidence in redone, or just checking the original study. But keep in mind that the difference between a full study and an update in cost can be significant because you have to recalculate the quantities of all the components. And there are many times when somebody calls us and say, my community is 20 years old, we need a full study. One of the questions we ask is, what have you been using for the last 20 years? And they'll say, well, we have a reserve study. We haven't updated it in 15 years. So we think that, so we need a new study. Well, you may not need a new study. You need a different type of update. You need an update of the study that's 15 years old, but now it's critical to look at the things that now fall within that 30-year time window that should be included, but you don't necessarily need a completely new study. So, when you're looking at it, ask the people that, you may want to ask or put in your RFP these kind of things, but it's not necessary that you need a full study redone. Even if you lost confidence, for example, you may have lost confidence because there's a component missing. Let's say the wood siding is missing and it's coming time to replace it, and you think you need to do a full study because that component was missing. It's not missing for any other reason than when the reserve study was updated every 3 years for the last 10 years, the provider did not look to see what should be added because it's not part of the standards. And now all of a sudden, the argument is, well, the siding was missing. It's missing because the study was done in accordance with the standards, but it didn't go over and above the standards to add that siding when it fell within that 30-year window. Improper replacement costs, people have said to us, well, the study is wrong because the cost to do the roof was $105,000. You have in your study $95,000. Again, it's budgetary costs. Improper quantities. My main point is that just because you're not happy or you feel that there's something wrong and there's a perception there's something wrong with a study, that doesn't mean you need to have a full study done. There are other ways to do it that can give you a correct study without redoing the entire thing. If you communicate,
what sources do you use to project the cost of replacing the components in the future?
Well, that's a trick question because you're saying in the future. Most reserve studies, I have an example that will address that because I think what you're saying is costs in the future is how do you take into account inflationary costs? That's how I read the question. Because what source you use to project the cost of replacing components in the future? The reserve studies are generally based on current costs, and people ask the question about making an inflationary cost and adding interest. I will answer that question in a few minutes. I have an example that gives you the answer to that question, if that's what you're asking. If that's not what you're asking, let me know. This next, what kind of study do you need? If you have an update performance community more than 5 years old, exactly what I talked about before. Make sure that time window now goes out 30 years and you're looking to see if there's things should be added, and take a look at the components that use a lot of maintenance or energy. So that can be evaluated also in terms of what the components are. So what else should you do at update time? These are not in the standards. I've beaten on that for a while, but add a maintenance schedule to your request for a reserve study and perform a life cycle cost analysis of the components, including evaluating the maintenance and energy. I always say that, or always say, I'm a pretty firm believer that if people take into account life cycle costing when they bid projects, for example, you have a community, you want to replace the fences. If you do life cycle costs for the fence and look at vinyl as opposed to wood, in most cases, the decision of what you're going to replace it will change when you start looking at these things. Standard reserve study does not look at it. Standard way of bidding projects a lot of time doesn't look at it. So look at these things. I mean, if you're putting a new roof on a building and you want to use 20-year shingle because it's slightly less expensive when you can get a 30-year shingle, if you get a 30-year shingle, your annual cost could still go significantly down, even though it costs slightly more in the beginning. So these are things that are not generally looked at, but should be looked at. All right, next thing is, what else do you do at update time? Separate lump sum components into individual components to more accurately reflect how replacement will take place. Now, here's an example. This is a community, a large community, where they have roofs, they have roads, they have all kinds of stuff. And the original reserve study, included all the roads as one lump sum and all the roofs as one lump sum. That's very typical of how reserve studies are done, making the assumption that all the roads will need to be redone in 20 years, all the roofs will need to be done in 25 years. As community get older, it's not a reality. The reality is that you're going to replace the roads based on the condition. You're going to replace the roofs based on the condition. You're not doing them all at once. In this case, what I'm talking about is consider breaking down the components into individual portions or sections rather than as lump sums to give you a more accurate funding plan and a more reality in terms of the way you do it. Very large community here on the left. What they did is they had us drone the entire community. This is a drone in the entire community. So we could then evaluate every roof and every road so that we could break it down by road and by roofs. So now to the right, you see the little arrow with the circle. That's a blow up of that area. Look at the condition of the roads you could see. So we went through and we looked at every road and we broke it down logically and did different roadway sections based on their condition in the reserve study rather than having it a lump sum. This is a good way of taking a reserve study from a budgetary tool into what I call a capital needs assessment or an actual replacement plan rather than a budget. But if you want to have that done, you can do it for your roofs, you can do it for your roads, do it for your balconies, do it for whatever you have in a community like this, that there's a lot of them, your sidewalks, whatever, because I promise you, when you have larger communities or even smaller communities, you're not replacing everything at once. Let your reserve schedule reflect what's actually there. And 99% of the time, the initial reserve study, which is updated and updated and updated, is based on lump sum replacements that don't take any of this into account. So take a look at this. Somebody raised their hand. Joanne? All right, now the next thing is prepare an RFP. What are the RFP? What should be in the RFP for reserve study? The minimum requirements that the preparer has a reserve specialist designation. CAI offers what's called the RS designation, reserve specialist. That essentially means that you've shown that you have the qualifications by education and actually by showing examples of your reports to CAI that show that you can do a reserve study in conformance with the national standards. Include in your RFP, obviously, the name of the association, the number of units, number of buildings, type of buildings, and age of community. If it's a full reserve study, you really need all of that information in order to put together the proposal. If it's an update, provide as part of your RFP a copy of the study to be updated. If it's a full study, identify the drawings available. For example, if you're doing a full study, you have one or two things in order to quantify what's out there. You select the components, then the question is how much of those components are there? You either go to the drawings and you do your takeoffs, or you go out into the field to measure them. If you don't have the drawings and everything has to be measured in the field, it takes much more time than doing it on the drawings. But if it's a full study, identify if the drawings are available and if field measurements are required. Field measurements take more time, no question about it. Let's see, where am I? Include a minimum of one meeting. Zoom meetings are great. There is no way that you will ever get a reserve study to match your community's needs unless you meet with the person who prepared it. It doesn't happen. It doesn't work. You need to have a meeting with the community where you can talk about what is the definition of adequate funding for them, how low do they feel the threshold is going to be, is comfortable for them to be, how often are they going to update it, all kinds of things to come up with a funding plan that meets the community. If you hire a firm to do a reserve study for you without a meeting, in many cases, you're just going to put it on the bookshelf and never use the study. So include a meeting, absolutely. Ask for, before you get a final report, ask for the numbers is what I say. And, you know, ask the preparer to give you the component inventory and give you the funding plan projections, then have a meeting and then finalize the report. I put in here payment terms. The reason I put in there payment terms is because one of the problems with firms like mine is that I would love to do this, but then we never get paid for the study because it takes months for boards to meet, blah, blah, blah. So set it up in such a way that when the provider gives you the numbers, the component inventory and the funding plans, that they get paid 90% of the study. Then you meet with them and you finalize what your plan is going to be. They issue the final report and they get paid the final 10%. But in a perfect world, take a look at the numbers, have a meeting, and come up with, you know, what the funding plan is for your community. All right. Ask for a standard study type, reserve update with field inspection or a full study, but then ask for options such as look at the entire community. This is critical. Look at the entire community, add components as required. Keep in mind, let's say we find a component like the wood siding that should now be added. You don't want us to just tell you add the wood siding. You want us to figure out the quantity of the wood siding as well as the replacement cost and actually add it to the study. So the proposal should include what are the hourly rates to add something to the study if we find that it should be added. But I think you all understand the issue now of make sure you look at the community as it gets older about adding things. Value engineering of replacements, we talked about that, maintenance and energy. You have to ask for preparation of a maintenance schedule, ask for an option. If you have a large community where you don't want it lump sum anymore, you want it broken down by roofs, roads, decks, whatever, ask for that in your RFP. And then the other thing is, ask the preparer, you may not use it, but say, okay, you're doing a study for us, give us a cost to update your study in 2 years from now. And you may want to sign them up for doing this one as well as updating it in 2 years. Ask the provider for any added value services they can offer. For example, some providers provide services that others don't. For example, one of the things that we are going to be doing very soon is when we do a study for you, you are going to have the ability to go through our website to a portal to go to your study and make adjustments to it anytime you want. Change useful lives, change replacement costs. If you replace something, change it. So you don't have to keep calling somebody like us to make adjustments. But those are some of the added value services that firms offer. For example, you saw that we also offer a drone evaluation to start breaking things down in large communities. I mentioned this before. One of the requirements should be that they have the reserve specialist designation, which education experience, licensed engineer, these type of things. And also keep in mind that if you're saving $1 in your reserve study, you really should consider the expertise of the company that's going to do it. Also keep in mind, if it's not updated, you as the manager should review the reserve study each year. What is anticipated next year? What happened in the past year? The actual funding match the proposed funding, but you should look at that each year for planning purposes. I'm sorry, go ahead.
How often should a building do a reserve study?
How often for the updates? I'll be there in 1 second. I know I'm running over, but you're all trapped, so you have to stay for another couple of seconds. I have a few more slides because I'm going to touch on exactly those type of questions. When you get a reserve study, what should you do? Look at the components, make sure it's correct. You live there, you know the common elements. Was anything added based on the aging of the community? We talked about that. Look at the components. Look at the beginning balance. Is the effective date right? Is the amount right? And then to see if you're funding right, the prior study you had has a projection and it says how much you should have set aside in a certain period in time. Look to see if it matches what the projection was from the past study. Look at the estimated remaining useful lives. Are there any planned replacements that are missed in here? For example, if you're planning on replacing roofs in 2 years and the study says it's 5 years, you have to tell the provider if you have any planned replacements. Take a look at any historical information. Are there any trends? Has the remaining lives dropped more than in the years past, than the years that passed? For example, if last time it said there were 10 years left, and now it says there are 3 years left, but it's 2 years later, why is that happening? It's a lack of maintenance. Take a look at the trends when you get to studies. Somebody asked, what is adequate? You have to determine your threshold. How low do you want it to go at some point in the future? And that can only happen by having a meeting with the provider and to discuss what are the variables here and what you should set that at. A couple of random thoughts. Some guidelines for update. How often should you update? Guidelines. Review the funding plan. If you're doing baseline funding and it's dropping down to 0, update it every year. If you're doing full funding where you have a huge amount of money sitting there, I would suggest don't wait more than 4 years, but maybe 4 years. If you're doing threshold funding, which is somewhere in between the two, it varies. Maybe it's still every year, maybe it's 2 years, 3 years, but as part of the study you get from somebody like us, for example, we'll recommend when your next update should be and why. Other things to look at is the age of the community. If it's older, I would update it more often since the useful lives, as I mentioned, have a tendency to reduce faster than the years. Maintenance plan. If there's no plan, update it more often. Type of construction. If it's a high rise, you may want to update it more often due to the complexity of the systems. Generally, high rises are updated more often. Some communities, as they get older, put in their budget updating the reserve study sometimes every year, other times every other year. Funding. If you haven't been funding per the plan, if the plan says $100,000 a year and you're only funding $50,000, you should update it more often. Maybe because maybe you're at baseline funding or you're running a deficit. Also, whenever you make a replacement or you add a new component, it should be updated. The thing I mentioned before was interactive, where you can go into your own study and make adjustments. If you replace a roof, you can go and actually do it. If not, you should have the fund updated, their schedule updated. Maybe it's just a paper update without a field visit to show that you've replaced something. And now you're amortizing the cost over the full useful life, so it has an effect on your funding. It may actually go down. Does the percent funded concept work? Some people say that you should include in your reserve study 10% of your annual budget. That's what actually FHA says when it comes to refinancing and mortgages and things like that. They use 1% of the budget for reserve study. And a reserve study that's less than 2 years old. I mean, I can go into a whole detail about that, but we don't have a lot of time, or out of time. But the percent budget, to me, percent of the budget doesn't really work. For example, high-rise community, the budget's $3 million, a lot of amenities, total reserve cost over 30 years is $8 million. Their annual budget is $3 million. You set aside 10%, that's $300,000. Now you have a townhouse community, budget's $3 million, much less amenities. Instead of $8 million, you have $3.5 million. 10% is $300,000. It's the same number based on percentage, but your amenities are much, much less. So the percentage is a guide, but to me, it doesn't work. Interest inflation, somebody asked this. Now, most reserve studies are based on current dollars, and the beginning balance is what you have in the beginning balance. You may decide to put your interest and leave it in there as part of your beginning balance, or you may decide to take it out. But the typical study in most cases is based on the no interest in inflation. Now, some people say, and there's one management company we deal with that wants their study to include interest inflation going forward. So what I did was I did a little example here. No interest inflation, your annual contribution is $58,180. If you add 2% interest and 3% inflation in the total projection, now you're collecting interest only on the money you've accumulated, but the inflation is on the total replacement cost. So it really skews the whole study. So I said, okay, if you do that, your yearly contribution is $112,910 instead of $58,180. So then I did another example, and I said, okay, let's update it every 3 years. Use the same 2% interest and 3% inflation. You get to the same number over time. It goes up to 108,000, which is pretty close to 112, but you're not saying it has to be 112. It increases over time rather than a jump in the beginning. So I do not feel that it's valid to add interest and inflation as a basic thing in your study because the interest and inflation don't offset each other. And I think that it increases the amount that you're setting aside more than it needs to if you do it based on just increasing it every time, doing the actuals when you actually when you actually update the study. What are the standards? National Reserve Study Standards, I mentioned this. There's a book put out by CAI, Reserve Funds and Investment Strategy. That's another thing. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants used to put out a book. Chapter 3 was Future Major Repairs and Replacements. They don't really publish that book anymore as a book, but if you want a copy of Chapter 3, we'd be happy to give it to you. CAI puts out a best practices paper, just came out, updated on reserve studies and management. There's also something put out by CAI, and you can see I'm on all these committees that have developed these things, but there's an explanation of reserve study standards based on the national standards, which actually takes the national standards and goes into a lot more detail. And that's something that's published nationally. If you'd like a copy of any of these, let us know. And I mentioned this before. This just came out from CAI. It's called Breaking Point. What the reserve study does not include when you're dealing with infrastructure repairs and things you can't see, such as risers and high rises. So I kind of rushed through the last thing, but does anybody have any questions? Feel free to call with any questions, email us with any questions. If you'd like a copy of the best practices paper, explanation, any of that stuff, just let us know and we'd be happy to send you a copy. And I went over by 13 minutes, but we're all working from our bedrooms, so it really doesn't matter, right? So please email us. I see a couple of people would like it. Let's see, were there any more questions? Would an engineer advise? I answered that. If you've replaced many components, do you need a full study? Great question. One of the things, be aware that when you're doing an update of study, the engineers can ask for two things, or they should ask for a minimum of two things. They want to know every single thing that's a common element that you've replaced since the last study was done, as well as the prices, so they could update the study to reflect that. They also should be asking for a copy of any maintenance contract you have for any of the common elements, because if you have a maintenance contract, for example, on elevator equipment in a high rise, you may not have to fund for everything because some of the things may be covered under the maintenance contract. But those are the things that when a study is done, or an update, you should be prepared to give information to the preparer, and you should be keeping track of obviously what components been replaced and these type of things. Let's see, census, that's true. And if you've replaced many components, you don't need a full study. You're updating a study, but it's going to reflect the replacement. Any other questions? Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. I appreciate you joining us today, and we'd love to give you a proposal for reserve study.